That change has required a loss. Trying to ignore it made it so much harder for me to accept whatever new was emerging. All of a sudden, I've gone from a partner at a consulting firm to unemployed, not knowing what was next. I had so equated the number of emails I got with my value in the world. The spider on my wall is not there to torment me and ruin my day, but failure hits right into the core of who you are. So to be a successful leader of innovation, you have to do the opposite of everything that has ever made you successful. Relax. Life is so much longer than you realize. There are moments that are going to break your heart.
To want to adjust their behavior and to influence the culture. What motivates somebody who's in the middle of an organization?
I really believe this is...
My guest today is Robyn Bolton, founder of MileZero and author of Unlocking Innovation. She's helped bring ideas to life that changed how we live, including Swiffer, that simple tool found in homes everywhere. But her story isn't just about innovation, it's about courage. When the firm she'd been with for 9 years was acquired, Robyn made the brave choice to walk away without a plan, facing fear and uncertainty head on. And that's where I want to start, with something she once said that's both powerful and deeply human. Every change involves loss, so give yourself space and time to grieve if you need to while you move forward. Robyn, take me back to that moment. What did that change feel like for you?
That was, talk about lessons learned the hard way. Having spent my whole career in innovation, but more than that, kind of always just having this feeling in life of we can do better, and not understanding why people would be resistant. Oh, let's just do better. Let's just try harder. Let's try something different. And eventually learning that people are afraid of change, not because they're afraid of change, but they're afraid they're going to lose something. And, then finally not finally, I shouldn't say, but having experiences in my life where there's been change, but that change has required a loss of something else, a loss of, um, you know, identity, a loss of friends, a loss of status, whatever that is, realizing that, yeah, with every change, there's loss, and trying to power through that, trying to ignore it, trying to pretend that that loss hasn't happened, made the change feel so much harder, and made it so much harder for me to accept whatever new was emerging. And finally kind of realizing just like any loss, like when you lose a family member, when someone passes away, when you lose a friend, you have to grieve the loss. It's part of the process. It's part of honoring what was, and you can't get stuck there. You've got to figure out, I had to figure out how to grieve, how to honor what was, and move towards what was becoming.
Let's apply this to the context of your big shift, being a career person and moving away from that career. And then this quote and what you just explained, I'm assuming are things that you learned throughout the process and things that you hope to share with others. So let's go back to that moment. Let's go back to what created this inception, this way of thought that you have right now. When you're in that place, working, stable career, that comfort, and when you realized you wanted to make that switch, and what was that transition like?
That transition was rough. So for context, kind of describe myself as the insecure overachiever. You tell me what success looks like and I'll go after it. Straight A's, got it. Degree from a good school, I'll go do it. And so at, the point in my life when this story occurs, had made partner at a consulting firm, was doing work that I loved doing. And all of a sudden, one day I got a call saying, hey, we're being acquired. And that forced a decision on a really rapid timeline of, was I going to stay with the acquisition or not? And ultimately, again, within a matter of days, I had to make that choice. And I ultimately chose not to go with the acquisition. But that also meant that I had to immediately leave my job, leave the firm. And I didn't have anything planned. I was always hearing like you go from one certainty to the next, you go from one job to the next job, you will always have a plan, you always have a safety net. And all of a sudden I've gone from a partner at a consulting firm and, kind of having this identity to now in a matter of days being unemployed, not knowing what was next, not even having an idea of what I wanted to do next. And every time I went out into the world, whether it was, going out to networking events, just going out with friends, realizing that this identity that I'd crafted where I could say, oh, I'm a partner at this firm, I do these things. I couldn't say that anymore. And so when people were like, hey, what, nice to meet you. What do you do? I would just be like, nothing. I lay on the couch in my pajamas because that's literally what I was doing. And, even to the point that I think a couple weeks in, I looked at my husband and was like, why is the Wall Street Journal the only thing that loves me? Because I had so equated the number of emails I got with my value in the world. And, the slow realization of how kind of upside down, quite honestly, things have gotten in life. And that I could beat myself up for that or say, you know what, this has happened. I am losing these things. And those were things that were really valuable to me. I liked being able to say I was a partner. I liked being affiliated with Clayton Christensen and his firm. I liked being having all those things be true about me, and they're not anymore. And I have to let that go. And I have to start figuring out, quite honestly, for the first time in my life, of I've checked all the boxes that people, society, my parents have given me. I need to create boxes now. I now have the freedom to determine what I want to be, who I want to be, what I want to create. And that's harder than I thought it was going to be. That is tougher. It takes so much longer. I'm also naturally an impatient person, but it was such an extraordinary experience to have that opportunity to create that I had never allowed myself before.
You mentioned something that I think really reflects a lot of people's headspaces when it comes to their work. It's their identity. You mentioned, I thought that was a great example. When you're out and you're introducing yourself, it's like you don't have that identity. It's like this blank line. So you probably feel a little bit awkward, I can imagine, in that situation where, you start to now compare yourself and you start to feel either worthy or not worthy in these moments, depending on what that blank line states. And if it's empty, you probably have more of a not worthy feeling. Nobody wants to say I'm in between. You also mentioned, which was very interesting, is you said, you checked all the boxes and you talked about the societal expectations, you talked about your parents, etc. I think about the identity of your work and that being a part of your identity. How much of that was really imposed on you based on societal expectations? And how did that impact your transition, knowing that this may not have been innately something you were aspiring for or you created, like you did the work and you got yourself to that level, but you mentioned society was a box check for you in terms of that achievement. So I want to understand that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there are definitely, kind of growing up and even, pretty far along into my career, it's hard for me to tease out what was I doing because I wanted to versus what was I doing because I felt like I had to. I mean, I think I'm naturally someone who wants to progress and push myself and, see, can I do the next thing? Can I do the next hard thing? And that that works really well with society who's saying like you need to get the promotion, you need to, work at the next fancy firm, you need to get the next logo on your resume, whatever that is. And so I think for a long time it meshed really well. And I would say how I did those things very much shaped by society. I was being a woman. I was very much told how I should behave, how I should approach people. I should be much softer. I shouldn't be direct as I am naturally. Several times I got feedback I should not use humor when talking with people, when presenting, when working with people, because it diminishes my credibility. And so kind of all of these stereotypes were reinforced in how I was supposed to behave. And those things weren't authentic to me. They didn't feel true to me. I remember even having a conversation with a senior partner at the firm who told me, he's like, you need to stop agreeing with the client. And I was like, why? The client is right. Like her hypothesis, her instinct of what needed to be done was correct. Why wouldn't I agree with her and reinforce that? And his response was like, well, if she's right, then she doesn't need us. And I'm like, well, maybe she doesn't need us. Like, what's the, and so I was just so confused by these norms and behaviors that were being told to me that I should adopt that didn't feel authentic. So I think if you look at my resume, there's a lot of me in it, but a lot of the how I struggled with because it didn't mesh with society's expectations or with the norms that were prevalent in the cultures in which I worked.
So it sounds like part of your identity in the corporate playing field was developed or given to you or imposed on you by societal expectations, and in this case, more of the organizational expectations.
Mhm.
So then why was it difficult for you to change, considering that these things weren't you, or these things weren't things that you created?
It was hard to change because I had been in an environment for so long that I interpreted my disconnect with those things as something being wrong with me, as those things are right. I need to mold myself to fit them, to be right, to be successful. And so, therefore, I couldn't do that. And that was a failure on my part. And so, there was, especially in, I was about to say the early days. I'm like, no, the early days lasted for years of judging myself as like, oh, I'm not meeting the standard. Like, I'm not doing what I should do. I'm not doing what is required for success. Instead of, instead of trusting my instincts and trusting who I am and realizing and acknowledging there's multiple paths to success and being who I am and being authentic to myself doesn't mean that I'm not going to be successful. It just means I'm going to be successful in a different way than, you know, this person who told me how to behave or that person who told me how to behave. That's their path to success. And it's not better, not worse, just different. But it took a long time to build the confidence to be able to recognize that.
What went into building that confidence? For people listening, what was your technique or strategy or practical tools that helped you build that over time?
The first step in solving any problem is recognizing you have one. And so the first step was just acknowledging all these thoughts that were in my head and all these feelings. It's just acknowledging them and then getting curious about it. And, I worked with the coach. I had, really deep, meaningful conversations with friends. I relied a lot and grew a lot in my faith. And it was really, I needed all of those different inputs, mechanisms to build kind of a complete understanding of what was going on and what I was struggling with, and to hear the different ways to think about it so that I could build the skill to hear different inputs and then figure out what I wanted to do and trust that instinct and do that and create my own path.
You talk about grieving the change, and you obviously had to make a decision. You made that decision. How do you grieve something like that? Is it something you just walk away from and you kind of wipe your hands off, or is it something you keeps you up at night for several weeks or months. Like, how do you grieve something like that?
I spent several weeks on the couch in my pajamas, um, and called it relaxing, but it was a lot of staring at the ceiling and wallowing and grieving and thinking about what had gone on and what had happened and all that. Then the other thing, and this is really hard for me to do, is to accept help and to show vulnerability. And so I had friends who were calling and being like, okay, what are you going to do now? Kind of that usual,
Yeah.
like, okay, let's go get them. And I felt this pressure of like, okay, I need to have a plan. I'll give myself 2 weeks to kind of wallow and relax and all that. And then I'm going to have a plan. And then I'm going to start interviewing. I'm going to do all these things. And I had a really good friend who had been through her own transitions in life. And she's like, you know what you need to do now? I'm like, tell me, what do I need to do? Like, give me a box to check. I'm on it. She's like, do whatever you want. If you want to lay in the grass and stare at the sky for the next 8 hours, go do that. She's like, just do whatever you feel like in the moment. And hearing someone who have tremendous amount of respect for, who is incredibly successful, by all metrics, her own and society's, say that, it was a little bit of permission to be like, okay, I can give myself a little bit of time. And then paired with that, another really good friend who's like, okay, now that you're not at a big consulting firm, I need your help on these things. And initially I told her no. I'm like, no, I'm not doing anything. I'm taking a sabbatical, doing nothing and helping you with something. And she didn't let up. She's very nice, very patient. She would call every week or two to check in and then say, okay, come help me. Come help me. And eventually I said, she wore me down and I said, yes. And that got me out of the pajamas and the wallowing on the couch into at least being active and doing something as a to get out of my own head and kind of get back out into the world in a way that was really, really safe and supportive.
Yeah, it reminds me of a similar experience that I had. It sounds like you were grieving at a time where you also looked at applying forward motion,
Mm-hmm.
and you weren't being like stuck in that area where it's like I'm just going to grieve without a plan. It's like you had a plan and you gave yourself space to really grieve in that moment. And it reminds me, I remember when I left my first job when I worked at a hospital, and I worked at the hospital for a while. It was about like 10 years I worked there through high school and through secondary school. And I remember when I was about to leave the company, I was about to leave there, and I brought in my resume, sorry, my resignation. And I remember driving into the parking lot and sitting there in the car for like a good hour with my resignation in my hand because I was so nervous about making this change. Like I had another job lined up. However, the security, the comfort, everything that I had, I was about to lose because I'm going to go on to this next journey, this next chapter of the unknown. And I'll always remember that little old young me just sitting in my car, just, worried about like this decision. Am I making the right decision? And I remember when I walked in and the supervisors were in their office and whatnot. And I walked in, I said hi, and I gave them the letter. And it just like everything, all the stress, all the anxiety, everything that I was feeling just dissipated. And I walked out of that office and I felt so great. I remember their faces after when they saw me, like they were in shock because I thought that, they probably thought I would never leave. So it was such a journey, and it was such a short amount of time. But it was such a journey that I remember that step of into the unknown and losing what you currently know and what you're used to and what you surround yourself with every single day. And like you said, it builds your identity. I think about that in the aspect of fear and that fear of failure. And you talk a little bit about that in your book. Um, you talk about the fear of failure and what is for people listening, what is that fear of failure in the context of your book and what you talk about?
So in the context of my book, I talk about, which is all about, corporate innovation, and that ultimately success in innovation, creating something new that creates value, is less about ideas and infinitely more about leadership and how you show up as a leader for new ideas. And the fear of failure, especially in corporate innovation work, is that, oh, we're going to create something and it doesn't sell. Or we're going to create something and it doesn't even get permission to launch into this world, and it'll get canceled. And then our little brains kick in. Mine is very good at this. And it's like, well, if it doesn't launch, then I'm not working on anything, and then I'll lose my job. And then my mother's voice comes in, and that, God bless her, that woman could go from something unexpected happening to death and destitution in like 4 nanoseconds. And the fear becomes, it doesn't launch. I lose my job. I will never get hired again. I will lose my home. I will lose my family. I will end up destitute. And the fear of a product failure suddenly becomes deeply, deeply personal. And it's it's how our brains are wired. You think about fight, flight, or freeze. Like that's the lizard brain, the oldest part of our brain. And so it's trying to keep us safe. But one of the things that I try to do in the book, and I really do try to apply in my life, is that it's not failure if you've learned something. And so when people say, oh, fail fast, no, I don't want to fail fast. I don't want to fail slow. I don't want to fail at any speed, but I do want to learn. And the best way to learn is often through trying something and it working out different than you expected. And so often that experience is called failure, but it's not. And so reframing our understanding of, is it failure? Is it learning? There's incredible value in learning. So let's focus there and on the value that we've created, not on the fact that our plans just didn't go as planned.
Interesting fact, 31% of Americans report being scared of failure. And that's higher than those afraid of spiders at 30%. And that one is really interesting, the fear of failure ranking so high in people's lives. Like for me, I look at both of those things as combined, because when I see a spider and I grab a Kleenex to snatch it, you know that thing you do when you try to snatch it off the wall and then the first thing you do is look in the Kleenex and make sure it's there? If I
Yep.
don't see it there, then my fear is multiplied at that point. I'm like, where did it go?
Yes.
But so I understand that. But why do you think failure is scarier for some people? Um, it's something that's like unimagined. Like, how am I supposed to put this? It's something that's not real, right?
Mhm.
If a spider is real, you see it, you may have a visceral reaction to it, and you may not like the way it looks. It could be poisonous depending on where you are in the country and what kind of spider it is. But why do people have a fear of failure if it's not in a sense real?
Yeah. So I also have a fear of spiders, and I don't even bother with the Kleenex. I just get a shoe, and I'm like, I will clean up the mess later because that thing has got to die. Because they're just so creepy. Um, but I think that's part of it, is like when you see a spider, or if you're, you feel like you have some control over what happens next. Like I can get the Kleenex, I can get the shoe, I can check that the spider's dead. There's a sense of, this is happening now and I have some agency. Whereas failure feels like it creeps up on you, and it just kind of like waylays you from, from the back or from the side, and you have no control. And even when you kind of have a sense that it's coming, you try so hard to stop it, and you can't. And so there's this sense that I don't have control. And it's also deeply personal. Like the spider on my wall is not there because he's decided to like torment me and ruin my day. The spider's probably there because he's hungry and is trying to go to his web that I haven't found yet, but when I find it, I will destroy it. Um, but failure is just so deeply personal, and it like hits right into the core of who you are, and your relationships and how you want to be perceived. And so it's just no control, deeply personal. It's and from out of nowhere. I understand it's a very scary thing.
To the control point, I remember reading a book written by Kobe Bryant, and he talked about fear doesn't exist. He said failure doesn't exist, and he talks about shooting free throws in a gym. He's saying shooting free throws in a gym by yourself, 7 o'clock in the morning, is the exact same mechanics of shooting free throws 7 o'clock at night in front of 20,000 people. The only difference is how you interpret the environment and and the experience of what's happening to you.
Mhm.
So how easy or difficult is it? And we know that Kobe, was an incredible basketball player, and obviously that led to a lot of his success. But I don't know if a lot of people have that same capacity or that same ability. When you think about the different types of fears of public speaking and whatnot, approaching people and things like that, I think we all create these stories. So what were your practical steps or processes that you took to overcome that fear of failure?
Pretty much what Kobe did, repetition. I mean, that's the thing is a lot of people, you brought up fear of public speaking. People are afraid of public speaking because they don't do it that often. They're not practicing public speaking every morning in the mirror at 7 a.m. They're doing it once a year, once a quarter, when they're giving a toast at a friend's wedding. And so it's these sporadic things. It's as if the first and only free throw they're taking is the one as the clock is expiring on game 7. And so for me, when my dad made me do speech and debate in high school, that is not the ticket to being cool in high school. And so I was not happy about it, but I did it. And so every Saturday, I was giving multiple speeches a day. I don't have a fear of public speaking now. Spiders were kind of a once a season thing, still afraid. So I think the repetition is really critical because part of getting good at something is being bad at it at first.
Mm-hmm.
Like so few people are good at anything the first time they do it. And so you have to give yourself space to be bad so that then you can be good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the repetition and just knowing at the start like I'm going to be bad at this. I'm going to feel scared. I'm not going to be comfortable and I'm going to do it anyways so that the next time this happens, it'll be a little bit easier. But yeah, it's
And
free throws.
those are great examples, and thank you for sharing. And I think those really, to me, those really sound like they address micro aspects of your day to day and things that you do, or maybe things that are an important composite of your personal life, your career, and things like that. But when you think about career changes, when you think about bringing new ideas to the table, um, repetition may not make sense in a lot of those cases, right? It's like, but how does that apply, that ability to overcome the fear of failure, which does reside in career changes or choosing a different path or going into a different relationship or innovating something new at work, etc. Like how does those practical abilities for overcoming fear apply in those instances?
Yeah. I think we looking for the the micro changes. So what I mean by that is, yeah, most of us don't make career changes every month. There's years will pass between career changes. But within a career, within a job, your responsibilities change all the time. And you're constantly being asked to take on a new responsibility or work with a new person. And so there's these micro changes. And how you handle the micro changes kind of can build, people talk about resilience, or it can build scar tissue, or it can build muscle memory that makes the big change seem a little bit smaller. Like, a career change, going to a new job, is a big thing. And you've also learned how to work with new people. So these are all new people, but you've kind of done this sort of before. You know, going to a new company is a big change, but you've taken on a different role in your past company, and so you kind of know sort of how to do that. So it's looking for those micro changes and truly honoring them as the micro changes that they are helping you build that capacity to make bigger changes.
What were the micro changes that you looked at when you were making your transition? Were there any that stuck out for you?
There was the one that sticks out the most to me, and this quite honestly was several years into, kind of post leaving the firm that I was at, several years into having my own company, was writing and how I expressed myself in writing. And my previous firm, because Clay Christensen had founded it, there were very close ties to Harvard, and so Harvard Business Review and Harvard Publishing. And so the view was it's something written, whether it's a blog post, an article, whatever, is only worthwhile or valuable if it's HBR quality. And so I held myself to that standard for a long time, and that held me back from writing and expressing myself in the written form, which was something I'd always loved to do. But suddenly, it's like, oh, well, this is an HBR quality, so I'm not going to write anything. And there was an issue going, I forget exactly what it was, an issue in corporate innovation going on. And I just got so frustrated and quite honestly emotional about how it was being handled that I'm like, I don't get, like, I have to get this out. I have to express my opinion. And so I just ripped off a blog post. It was like 500 words. It was so far from HBR quality, but it was deeply authentic. And I got more positive reaction and response and engagement from doing that than anything else that I had written in the years prior to it. And so it was kind of this moment where just I couldn't contain myself anymore, that it overpowered all of the messages in my head. And it just forced itself out and then became this proof point of like, oh, wait a minute. I can do this. And maybe I should do some more of this. And again, what can I learn? And I could have looked back and been like, oh, I failed for years to put my opinion out there. It's like, no, I just learned in like the most incredible way that putting myself out there in my authentic voice is so much more engaging to the people that I'm writing for than writing in this voice that I was told was proper and what I should be doing.
It sounds like in a lot of ways the fear of overcoming the fear of failure is consistency, is persistence.
Yeah, persistence. As my grandfather used to say, I'm not stubborn, I'm resolute. So being resolute and truly trusting yourself. And it can take a long time depending on what you've been through to trust yourself. But when you get there, trusting your gut, trusting who you are, trusting your instincts and how you see the world, I mean, that's everything.
How do you think failure shows up differently between your personal life and business?
Uh, so what I think about most honest is failure in my personal life is anytime I try to cook or bake anything. Um, I'm not a natural cook. It's not something I ever love to do, but my husband has a lot of very severe food sensitivities. So he has to be gluten free, dairy free, a whole bunch of other things. And I really love cookies and cakes and things like that. So, like, I'm going to figure out how to cook my favorite treats gluten and dairy free. And there's a lot of failure. Like, and it's not the kind of failure where like, oh, it doesn't taste as great as it could, but like it's still edible. No, it's just like we're gonna pretend this never happened. Um, and it's so much easier for me to accept that. I still don't like it because I'm like, well, I kind of feel like I'm wasting money, but like, whatever. I tried and I learned something, and maybe I'll try it again in a different way. Maybe I just, will admit defeat. And so it's easier for me to accept kind of failure because it seems so small scale. Um, but in business, in my business, in my work life, failure seems so much bigger. And because it feels also so public, even if it's not. One of the things kind of going back to writing is, I write an article every week. I post on my blog. I post it out, send it out to people to read. And the reason I do that is because I've started this habit of every Thursday an email goes out to people. And in my head, I'm like, if I don't get an article out to everyone Thursday, here are the things they're going to now believe about me and judge me for. And I can't be trusted. I'm irresponsible, all these negative things. And I know no one is going to think that. Like, the reality is, no one is going to judge me for not getting something out on Thursday. But in my head, I'm hearing this voice saying all these negative things. And I've learned to be like, okay, kind of talk to the inner critic. Thank you. I know you're trying to keep me motivated. I'm going to take the motivation that is at the root of this, and I'm going to take the positive aspect of that and work for it. And you know what? There have been a couple of times where something hasn't gone out on Thursday. And then I've gotten to practice, forgiving myself and shrugging it off and making a joke about it and then moving on.
Mm-hmm. I love the concept that you talked about in your experience of like listening to your inner thoughts, and your inner thoughts sometimes are not good. A lot of the
Oh,
times your inner
no.
thoughts are very, self-loathing, and it's unfortunate because I think we're our harshest critics. However, I think there's opportunity to go through that. Like for myself, I go through a lot of, not a lot of, but I go through negative self-talk. But I do that because I'm the type of person that needs to lay everything out there. It's almost like facing myself. I think the key of it, though, what bridges yourself to move forward after negative self-talk is ownership. You talked a little bit about it earlier, is acknowledging your mistakes, acknowledging your hesitations, acknowledging your gaps. And it's okay to beat yourself up as long as you are not being critical to yourself to a fault where you're going to demoralize yourself, but you're being critical to yourself by saying, I didn't do this well. I made a mistake. But having grace with yourself, I think, is so important. And you talked about this earlier in terms of learning from your failure. And I believe that. I believe failure is only failure if you didn't learn anything from it.
Yep.
So learning from it, understanding, what did I learn from this experience? What do I need to go back to and understand? And I will say this, I'm somebody who is very passionate about learning as much from your success as you do learning from your failures. A lot of the times we learn from our failures, that's when we're in this negative headspace. Obviously, you're seeing a lot of negative, and it can create a narrative or a feeling or an environment where you're not going to feel successful. You are going to feel very hard on yourself. However, if you spend equally as much time, or if not more, focusing on your successes and dissecting when you win, then you'll start to really balance that out, right? And you won't be in a position where you're feeling constantly as though you're failing, because you're taking time to analyze your successes and realizing, what did I do well there? I think there's an opportunity there to kind of focus in on what it is that you did and what it is that allowed you to feel the way you feel right now. And I think more people should find themselves in those head spaces, because it's a really good place to be. Imagine being in your head when you are winning and you're succeeding and you're breaking everything down. Like, doesn't that just sound more enjoyable?
Yeah, I had a coach once, and she absolutely knows. She's like, if you're spending a lot of time in your head, you're spending a lot of time in a bad neighborhood.
Mm,
And it created such an image in my mind of when I get into the negative self-talk, I actually see this terrible, decrepit neighborhood. I'm like, I don't want to be here.
Mm.
And it's, again, kind of becoming conscious of the subconscious. And so one of the tricks, and this is actually something that I brought from my work in a corporate innovation into my own personal life, is a lot of times in innovation, you know, the structures, a lot of functions like legal, et cetera, their job is to keep the company safe. And so they say no to things that are uncertain. And so one of the things that I coach innovators to do is, when you run into someone who just says no, one, view it as the start of a conversation, not the end. But two, acknowledge the no and say, totally get it. What do you need to see to say yes? Because it changes the conversation into one of equals and partners looking for a path forward. And then, I've said that enough times that it actually stuck in my head. It's like, wait, when I'm in this bad neighborhood, when my inner critic is slamming, be like, okay, I hear you. You're trying to keep me safe. What do we do differently to do better next time? What can we learn from this? How do we move forward? And kind of engaging that inner critic, just as you would engage somebody in a company who says no, engaging the inner critic and like, okay, let's figure out how we do better.
Let's talk about innovation. You, your framework, ABC, what is that?
ABC, it is the architecture, behavior, and culture required for innovation. So architecture is, the strategy, structures, process, governance, metrics, all of those very businessy things that all the books are written about, all including mine. The articles, that's what, businesses focus on, because it's things that businesses do. Like, this is the work. And that is where what I lovingly call the innovation industrial complex that grew up, 30 years ago, that is where we have solely been focused. And all of that stuff, the architecture of innovation, is important and it is essential. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient to succeed. What is required to succeed is the behaviors, and specifically the leadership behaviors that people, whether they're in positions of power, so they're leaders based on hierarchy or leaders based on kind of the social dynamic, how they show up in the work, in key decisions, in key moments. And you have to have the right behaviors at work. And that is exceptionally difficult because for most people, especially as you think about folks working in companies, what has made them successful is getting really, really good at operating, of just, kind of, I don't want to, it sounds diminishing to say doing the same things better, but it is about anticipating cause and effect. It's about anticipating issues that will come up, having the answers, knowing what needs to be done. And innovation is the opposite of that. You've never done it before. You don't know what cause and effect is. You don't have the answers. And so to be a successful leader of innovation, you have to do the opposite of everything that has ever made you successful. And that's really, really hard. So behavior is absolutely critical. And then C is the culture. It's the environment in which you are innovating and making sure that at the very least, there's a culture that's not opposed to doing something new. It's not opposed to trying something different. And eventually, hopefully, through the success in architecture and behavior, you can actually shift that culture to be one that embraces change and does search for better and think constructively and creatively.
How challenging is that when I think about the ABC and architecture, behavior, and culture? I think the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, behavior creates culture. The repetition of behaviors of the people ultimately decides the culture. However, a lot of the behaviors are driven by the architect of that organization. What people are expected to do, the high pressure, high demand, high expectations, everybody trying to move up the rung on the ladder, people stepping over people, etc. How does one be innovative in an environment where that is pervasive?
Great question. First thing is self-awareness. And that's actually kind of where I start off, the book in talking about the ABCs, but I start off with because behavior is so critical. You have to start there. And it's about getting really honest with yourself of, you know, it if I've been told that I need to innovate, why have I been told that? Is that actually important to me? How do I define it? What am I willing to do to innovate? What am I not willing to do? And building that self awareness, because too often what happens is you'll have leaders, you'll have executives at the company be like, we're going to innovate. And then what happens, the architecture, the rewards is exactly what you described of, okay, do it better, faster, cheaper, work your way up the ladder. And so you have this disconnect between the words and the actions will always win. And the actions, what people see happening is what drives the culture. And so if leaders aren't honest with themselves about what matters and what they're willing to do and not willing to do, there will inevitably be a disconnect that just kills innovation, either rapidly or slowly. But either way, people are very quickly going to learn that the questions and creativity and thinking differently are not welcome here. And so you've got to be honest with yourself first. The other thing is, look, there are people who don't want to innovate. They don't want to do something new. They want to be amazing at what they're currently doing. And your company needs those people, the operators, as much as they need the innovators, and you've got to love them both equally. And so many companies are like, innovation is everyone's job. No, it's not. If people don't want to do it, don't make them play your reindeer games. Let them be awesome at what they want to be awesome at and value them for that. And then the people who do want to change things up, or at least curious about it, give them a way to do that. But don't try to make everybody be the same, because they're not.
In your book, you use to illustrate this framework three people: Hope, Faith, and Victor. I have to say, I love what you did with the names there.
Yeah.
Quickly summarize each of their roles in accordance to the framework and kind of give us an idea of what that looked like for each of them.
Yeah, so Hope starts off the book and she is the leader that kind of typifies the A, B, and C's of year one. So when you're first starting out. And she is a leader who just naturally has all the behaviors that I would look for in an innovation leader. She was a very senior executive. She was a member of the C-suite, so she had the CEO's ear. But what she was trying to create was anathema to the architecture and the culture of the organization. And so the work that she really had to do was to set up something, to set up a team, to set up an architecture within the existing constraints of the company and what the company would allow and accept that could be effective in what she was trying to do. And so her struggle was kind of creating something within the company that wouldn't be automatically rejected, and then also to figure out how to work with peers that saw things very differently than she did, people who were very much operators at heart. And so while she was phenomenal at leading her team and inspiring, a broader organization to innovate, she ran into a lot of challenges with her peers. And that was kind of the behavior learning of her first year of how to be successful. Faith really typifies the second year of a leader's time, where they've got things sort of up and running, but they have to produce results because companies are very impatient. And Faith she really had to rethink architecture. again, she had kind of the innate behaviors, but the architecture that her boss had set up in year one was crumbling. And so they were in a real crisis mode of not being able to produce results, but also creating a culture that was very cynical and doubtful of what they were trying to do. And so that's what Faith struggled with. And her role in terms of for the behavior was managing up. And how could she take this thing that was falling apart that her boss had created and had pride of ownership around? How could she recreate it to something that would ultimately be effective without hurting his feelings? And then Victor, who's like year three, and he has a slightly longer story because he goes through a couple rounds. Um, but again, he's kind of running into to culture headwinds despite having architecture and behavior really kind of going on along at a good pace. But he was running into a challenging environment. The economy was crumbling, the company was not doing well, and so there was a fear within the company and within the executive team, or why should we be taking risks when it feels like the ground is crumbling beneath our feet? And Victor was able to not just say, but to show that actually the work we're doing that looks risky on paper is what's reinforcing our foundation and giving us a way to build to strengthen the future.
Thank you for explaining that. I'm curious how these stories created this framework for you. Where was the connection there?
Yeah, it really kind of all comes down to the insight that took me several decades to get to around that innovation is not an idea problem, it's a leadership problem. And so as I reflected back on the companies that I'd worked with where there was incredible innovation success, who were the leaders and what were the things that they were doing? And so sadly, it was very easy to identify the handful of leaders who really were truly successful at innovation. And I say success in the sense that they created value. And whether that value was internal within the company and building a culture, whether it can be measured, in revenue or profit, there was incredible value creation because of them and the way they led. And then looking at, okay, what was the architecture they put in place to support themselves? What was the culture that rippled out as a result of their efforts? But then how did they really show up and lead in a way that brought everything together and set them up for that success?
There's a lot of personal choices, decision making that people had to make in these stories that you so eloquently put together. How does one make the connection of these stories, not just in corporate life, but in personal?
Yeah, and the stories are about people, and so there's in Hope's story, part of her story is she wanted to set up this innovation team, and part of her motivation was she wanted to uh, get the title Chief Innovation Officer. And so she brought forward her proposal, she laid everything out. The CEO said, "Absolutely, we're going to do this, and I'm going to name this guy who we thought was going to retire. I'm going to name him Chief Innovation Officer." And at that moment, Hope really thought about just kind of giving up because she wasn't getting what she personally wanted, even though she was getting what she felt the organization needed. And she had to come to terms with that kind of, job versus personal motivation. And ultimately, she did decide to carry forward, but it was a really tough moment where she had to go inside and really figure out, okay, what is it that matters most to me? Is there a different path to success than what I thought? Um, and get creative and open her mind, but also, as we talked about at the very beginning, grieve the fact that her initial plan didn't work out. But be resilient, be a little bit stubborn, and say, okay, is there another path to where I want to go?
Which one of the ABCs for you, Robin, do you connect with the most when you think about your journey?
Behavior
Right?
and really seeing the the leadership behavior and seeing how just how so often um there are brilliant ideas that come up. There are brilliant opportunities just laying out there for companies to grab. And the wrong leader will kill it all. The opportunity will not be seized. The idea will not be pursued. You know, the most brilliant idea can be killed by a leader who's asking the wrong questions, saying the wrong things, engaging in the wrong ways. Whereas I have also seen the great innovation leaders with the right behaviors can turn a very mediocre idea or uninspiring opportunity into something truly world changing. And so I'm always very attuned to the impact of those of leaders and their behaviors and what works and what doesn't and the rippling implications of that.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. Robyn, is there anything that you felt we didn't talk about yet that you would like to bring up?
The only other thing, and we did touch on this a bit, the culture. And as you said, culture is so often the result of the architecture, is so often the result of behavior. And I really think people miss that point. Too often I get calls to say, hey, we need your help to build a culture of innovation. I'm like, okay, well, you're willing to completely change the way you interact with people for the next 10 years because then you'll have a culture of innovation. And they're like, no, we want to have a hackathon. I'm like, that's not how you build a culture. Um, and but the recognition of it is what you do, not what you say, and it's what you do over time that creates the culture. So if you have a culture that is not the culture you want, you need to look at, yourself, but then also the folks around you. What are you doing? What are you saying? How are you behaving? How are you rewarding people that is creating that culture? And therefore, how do you have to change the culture so that it is something that you want?
So it's that real deep inner work. It sounds like, based on some of the conversations you've had in
Yeah.
meetings with companies, etc., it's like this culture is something you buy off a shelf and you can just apply it to the corporation and to the departments however they see fit without
Yeah.
looking at those other things that drive culture, which is behavior, and the architecture. And obviously, behavior is a lot easier to change. You know, you could probably change most behaviors in an instant if you're aware of it and you're motivated to do it. Architecture is probably a little bit more challenging because there's systems and process and policies that
Yeah.
need to be uprooted. First, they need to be uncovered, then they need to be uprooted. And there's probably a lot of tangling between systems and processes and cross and interdepartmental work. So that to me seems like overwhelming work. So why would anybody be motivated to want to adjust their behavior and to influence the culture, especially, Robyn, if we're talking about not people who own the company, where that decision can happen in based on that person's autonomy to make it happen. Um, but what motivates somebody who's in the middle of an organization? Why would I do that? Why would I put myself through that?
That is exactly the right question. And I really believe this is probably an unsatisfying answer, but it's what I've seen to be true is that there are people who are just wired that way. They are just wired to see the potential of something and to be driven nuts by the fact that there's a gap between what is and what could be. There are people who want to do better, whatever that is, however that's defined. There are people who see opportunity so clearly and it's just in their nature to pursue it. And those people exist everywhere in the company. And it's just a matter of finding those people and then figuring out, okay, how can we, as kind of a small band of um, optimistic and realistic rebels, how do we start kind of being that change we want to see? How do we start helping people think differently and, quite honestly, see the potential that we see so clearly? Because not everyone sees it, and so we have to first kind of show what could be and then lead people there.
How does one find those people?
It'd be so great if we could just wear a badge to be like, hey, we can do better. Um, it it's the people who ask questions, the people who say, why are we doing it this way? It's the people in organizations who are kind of the squeaky wheels. I call them, again, very lovingly, and I put myself in this camp, they're the misfit toys. And they um they just don't understand why things are the way they are, and they're curious about it. And that is such a good signal that they're like, oh no, this person is thinking differently, and they're seeing something I'm not. And how can I get curious to kind of unleash that?
And slip them a note and just kind of be
Yeah.
like, see how they react.
Yeah.
Are you one of me? Are we on the same team?
Yeah. Are you, I mean, are, I know we both look like zebras, but do you also maybe have a pink stripe somewhere or blue stripe? Like, are you, yeah, they'll out themselves eventually.
That's incredible. And I love that. That's really good advice and really good support for a lot of people who believe what you believe and want to make that impact and want to be innovators, and they understand the ABC and they just are struggling on where to go and what to do. So thanks for that. I think that helps a lot. So this is the part of our conversation where I give you the stage and the spotlight, and you read that letter to your former self. So I will give you the floor.
Thank you. So, dear Robin, relax. Life is so much longer than you realize, and a career is even longer than you can imagine. Not everything has to happen at once. In fact, not everything even needs to happen quickly. There are things that are not going to work out. There are moments that are going to break your heart, and those will be the things and the moments that lead you to where you need to be. You can't control everything. I know you will try. Have grace with yourself when things don't work out, and know for absolute certain there are silver linings on everything. And that, again, those moments that break your heart are going to make your heart soar someday. You just don't know when. So be patient, have grace, and just relax.
That was excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I felt that. That was very heartfelt,
Yes.
very impactful. Robin, thank you for this incredible conversation today. I know you have a lot to give. You've given me a lot, so thank you. And I know you'll be giving a lot more people more of what they need once they have a chance to listen to you and go get your book. So thank you for being here with me.
Oh, no, thank you for creating the space to share my story, and for all the other folks to share their stories. It's a sacred space, and so thank you for creating it and for creating the time to do it.